Fire roared through the halls of Blackthorn Castle, and Alira Brine was already running before she understood why. She had been folding linens in the servants' corridor when the first scream tore through the night. Not a scream of surprise, a scream of death. She dropped the sheets and pressed herself against the stone wall, heart slamming against her ribs, listening as boots pounded overhead, and voices she did not recognize shouted orders in a language of command that did not belong to this castle. The Blood Moon Festival had begun only hours earlier. She had watched from the kitchen doorway as King Corwin Vale raised a goblet to his people, his mate Queen Aveline laughing beside him, their two sons chasing each other around the long banquet table. It had been a night of light and music. Now it smelled of smoke. Alira was an Omega, and Omegas in Blackthorn Pack did not ask questions when the world turned dangerous. They survived. That instinct, buried deep in her bones since childhood, was the only thing keeping her upright now as she pressed her back to the wall and tried to think. The nursery, the boys. She did not decide to move. Her feet simply carried her, past overturned tables and shattered glass, past a fallen guard whose face she did not let herself look at too closely, up the servant stairs that wound behind the West Tower. She had walked this path 100 times carrying folded clothes and warm milk. Tonight she walked it, carrying the last hope of a dying kingdom, though she did not yet know it. The nursery door was ajar. Inside, 5-year-old Cale stood frozen beside his little brother's crib, his small hands balled into fists, his eyes wide and dry in the particular way of children who are too frightened to cry. Finn, barely 3, was already awake, and reaching his arms up, sensing the fear in the room, before he understood any of its causes. "Where is my mother?" Cale said. Not a question, a demand, the way his father might have made it, though his voice shook. Alira did not answer him with words. She scooped Finn from the crib and pressed him against her shoulder, and she took Cale's small hand in hers, and she said only, "We have to be very quiet now. Can you do that for me?" Cale looked at her the way he had never looked at her before, not as the maid who brought his supper, but as someone who might, in this moment, be the only person standing between him and whatever was happening beyond that door. He nodded. They did not take the main stairs. Alira led them instead to the narrow servant passage hidden behind a tapestry of the Vale family crest, a passage she knew because she had spent 3 years of her life scrubbing its stones on her knees. The tapestry fell closed behind them, muffling the sounds of chaos into a distant roar, and for a moment, in the dark, it was almost possible to believe that none of this was happening. Below them, in the great hall, King Corwin Vale was discovering exactly how far betrayal could reach. He had trusted Draven Ashcombe for 11 years. Draven had stood at his right hand through 3 border conflicts, had held his infant sons on the day of their naming, had sworn oaths of loyalty that Corwin had never once thought to question. It was Draven's voice that Corwin heard now, cutting through the smoke and the screaming, calm and satisfied in a way that turned Corwin's blood to ice. "You built a kingdom on the backs of people you never bothered to see, Corwin," Draven said, standing over him as 2 of his men forced the king to his knees amid the wreckage of his own throne room. "I have simply decided to see them instead." "Where is my wife?" Corwin said. His voice did not shake, even now. "Where are my sons?" Draven's expression flickered, something almost like regret, passing behind his eyes before it hardened again into resolve. "Your wife made a choice tonight. She chose to fight rather than run. I am told the fire finished what my men could not." Something inside Corwin broke that he would spend years trying to name. It was not quite grief, not yet, because grief required acceptance, and he could not accept this, not the way Draven said it so plainly, as though Aveline's death was a fact already settled into history, rather than a wound still bleeding in front of him. "And my sons," Corwin said again, quieter now. "I have men searching the castle," Draven said. "If they are found, they will be dealt with according to what is necessary." Necessary. The word landed on Corwin like a physical blow. He surged forward against the hands holding him down, and for a moment, his alpha strength nearly broke free, nearly closed the distance between himself and the man who had once called him brother. But there were 4 guards holding him, and 11 years of trust had left him no army of his own to call upon. He was dragged backward, and the last thing he saw before they struck him unconscious was the throne room burning behind Draven's silhouette, the golden crest of House Vale curling black at the edges, like a piece of paper thrown into a fire. High above, in the servant passage, Illyra felt the castle shake with a distant boom, and she pulled the boys closer and kept moving. She did not know what had happened to the king. She did not know if the queen was alive or dead. She knew only that two small boys were depending on her, and that the passage led eventually to a low door that opened into the kitchen gardens, and that beyond the gardens there was a wall, and beyond the wall there was a forest that Draven's men, in their hunger for the castle's riches, might not think to search for hours yet. "I'm scared," Finn whispered against her shoulder, the first words he had spoken since waking. "I know," Illyra said. "I am too, but being scared doesn't mean we stop. It just means we're smart about how we move." She did not know where that steadiness in her voice was coming from. She had never led anyone anywhere in her life. She had spent her whole existence being told where to stand, what to carry, when to speak, and when to stay silent. But something had shifted in her the moment she stepped into that nursery, some quiet certainty settling into her chest that these two boys were now hers to protect, whatever that would come to cost her. The kitchen was empty when they reached it, though pots still simmered on the fire, abandoned mid-meal by cooks who had fled at the first sign of trouble. Illyra grabbed a satchel from a hook by the door, and without stopping to think too carefully about what she was doing, she filled it with bread, a wedge of cheese, a water skin, and a small knife she had used 100 times to peel vegetables, and now might have to use for something else entirely. Cale watched her with sharp, careful eyes. "You're taking us somewhere," he said. "Yes. Will we come back?" Illyra paused, her hand on the low garden door. She thought of the honest answer, and then she thought of the boy in front of her, only 5 years old, who had already lost his mother tonight and did not yet know it, and she gave him the answer he needed instead. "When it's safe, we'll come back when it's safe." It was not quite a lie. It was a promise she intended to keep, even if she did not yet know how. The garden was dark and cold, the autumn air biting through Illyra's thin dress, as she led the boys along the hedge line toward the outer wall. Behind them, the castle burned against the night sky, an orange glow that lit the clouds like a second sunset. Illyra did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back only slowed a person down, and tonight, more than any night of her life, she could not afford to slow down. There was a gap in the outer wall, where the stones had crumbled years ago, one that the castle's builders had never quite gotten around to repairing, and generations of children had used it as a secret way in and out of the grounds. Illyra had discovered it herself as a girl, sneaking out to pick wildflowers with the other kitchen maids. Tonight it became something else entirely, an escape route for the last true heirs of Blackthorn Pack. She lifted Finn through first, then guided Cale's small body through the narrow gap, scraping her own shoulder raw as she squeezed through after them. On the other side lay the forest, dark and vast and utterly indifferent to the tragedy unfolding behind them. "Where does it go?" Cale asked, staring into the trees. "I don't know yet," Illyra admitted, "but it goes away from here. That's enough for tonight." She took his hand again, adjusted Finn on her hip, and stepped into the forest. Behind her, the castle continued to burn. Somewhere within its walls, King Corwin Vale lay unconscious on cold stone, believing his sons had died in the flames, along with everything else he had ever loved. He did not know that a quiet Omega Maid, a woman whose name he had perhaps heard a dozen times in passing and never once truly registered, was at that very moment carrying his entire bloodline into the dark, armed with nothing but a satchel of bread and a determination that would prove, in the years to come, far stronger than any army Draven Ashcombe could ever raise. The forest swallowed them whole. Branches closed overhead like a canopy shutting out the burning sky, and the sounds of the castle faded into the ordinary rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. Illyra walked until her legs ached, until Finn had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her shoulder, and Cale's steps had begun to stumble with tiredness he refused to admit to. Finally, when she judged they had put enough distance between themselves and the castle, she found a hollow beneath the roots of an old oak tree, sheltered from the wind, and she settled the boys inside it, wrapping her own shawl around them both. "Sleep now," she told Kale, who was fighting to keep his eyes open, watching her the way a soldier might watch for an enemy on the horizon. "I'll stay awake. I'll watch over you both." "Promise," Kale said. It was not quite a question. "I promise," Elira said, and meant it with every part of herself. She sat with her back against the oak's rough bark, listening to the forest breathe around her, and she did not sleep at all that night. She thought, instead of the castle burning behind them, of the king she had glimpsed only from a distance, of the queen who had likely given her life trying to protect these very children, and of the long, uncertain road that now stretched ahead of a maid who had never in her life been asked to be anyone's protector. By morning, the fire at Blackthorn Castle had burned itself out, leaving nothing but blackened stone and ash where a golden kingdom had once stood. Draven Ashcombe stood in the ruins of the throne room, surveying what remained of his conquest, and gave the order that would echo through the pack for years to come. "Find the king's sons," he said. "Dead or alive, I want proof either way." Deep in the forest, wrapped in a stolen shawl beneath the roots of an ancient oak, two small princes slept on, unaware that the search for them had already begun, and that their survival now rested entirely in the steady, unyielding hands of a woman the world had never thought to notice. 3 days after the fall of Blackthorn Castle, Draven Ashcombe sat upon a throne that did not yet feel like his own, listening to reports from men who had spent every waking hour combing the forest for 2 missing boys, and finding nothing but empty trails and cold campfires. They could not have survived alone, one of his commanders insisted, pacing before the dais. A woman and 2 young children, in that forest, with winter coming. It is not possible. Then find their bodies, Draven said, though something in his voice suggested he did not fully believe his own command would be obeyed. He had known Corwin Vale's sons since their births. He had held Kale in his arms on the day of the boy's naming ceremony, and sworn, as every pack elder swore, to protect the bloodline with his life. That oath sat uneasily in his chest now, a splinter he refused to examine too closely, because examining it would mean admitting what he had become. Deep in the forest, Elira Brine understood instinctively that survival meant staying invisible. She had grown up poor, in the lower quarter of Blackthorn territory, where an Omega learned early that the world rewarded those who could disappear when danger came looking. She used that same instinct now, leading the boys away from the main roads, away from the small hunting trails where Draven's search parties were most likely to pass, deeper into parts of the forest that even the castle's mapmakers had never bothered to chart. "I'm hungry," Finn said on the morning of the second day, tugging at Elira's sleeve with the particular insistence of a 3-year-old who did not yet understand that hunger was sometimes something to be endured rather than immediately solved. Elira knelt and broke off a piece of the bread she had taken from the castle kitchen, already down to less than half a loaf. She split it carefully between the 2 boys, giving them the larger portions and keeping only a small piece for herself, though her own stomach had been aching since the previous evening. "When this runs out, what will we eat?" Kale asked. He had a habit, she was noticing, of asking the questions that Finn was too young to think of, and that she herself was trying not to dwell on too long. "There's food in a forest, if you know where to look," Elira said, and hoped she sounded more confident than she felt. She had spent her life in kitchens, not in wilderness, but she had grown up watching the older women of her village forage along the forest's edge for mushrooms and berries and roots when the winters were lean, and she carried fragments of that knowledge with her now. Like scattered coins, she was desperately trying to gather into something useful. She found a patch of wild blackberries by midday, half-withered but edible, and a stream running clear over smooth stones, where she filled the water skin and let the boys drink their fill. Small victories. She learned to measure the days, not in hours, but in these small victories, each one a reason to keep moving forward. On the 3rd night, the weather turned. A cold rain began to fall, soft at first, and then harder, soaking through the thin fabric of their clothes within minutes. Finn began to cry, not the frightened tears of the first night, but the exhausted, miserable tears of a child who had reached the absolute end of what he could bear. Elira searched frantically through the darkening woods until she found a rocky outcropping with enough of an overhang to offer some shelter from the worst of the rain. She built what protection she could from fallen branches and the dampest of her own clothing, and she pulled both boys against her body, sharing what little warmth she had left to give. "Tell us a story," Cale said suddenly, his voice small against the sound of the rain. "Mother used to tell us stories when we couldn't sleep." Elira felt something tighten in her throat at the mention of the Queen, spoken so plainly by a child who did not yet know, could not yet know, that his mother would never tell him another story again. She had not told either of the boys what she suspected about Aveline's fate. There would be time enough for that grief later, when they were somewhere safer than a rain-soaked forest, with enemies still searching the trees for them. "What kind of story?" she asked instead. "A brave one," Cale said, "with a happy ending." Elira thought for a long moment, the rain drumming steadily against the rock overhead, and then she began to speak, weaving together fragments of old tales she remembered from her own childhood, with details invented on the spot, a story about two brothers separated from their kingdom, who found their way home again, through courage and cleverness, and the help of a friend, who never once gave up on them. She did not know, as she spoke, how closely the story she was telling would come to mirror the years that lay ahead of them all. By the time she finished, Finn had fallen asleep against her chest, his small breaths finally even and calm. Cale remained awake a moment longer, watching her with those same sharp, careful eyes that seemed far too old for a boy of 5. "Will it have a happy ending?" he asked quietly. "Our story. Not the one you told. The real one." Elira looked down at him, at the dirt smudged across his face, and the fear he was trying so hard not to show, and she made a decision in that moment that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Yes," she said. "I promise you, Cale, it will." She did not know, that night, huddled beneath a rocky overhang in a storm, soaked through and hungry, and utterly without resources, how she would ever keep that promise. But she had learned something about herself in the 3 days since the castle burned, something she had never had cause to discover before, that she was far stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever given her credit for. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Blackthorn Castle, King Corwin Vale opened his eyes in a cell far beneath the ground, chained to a wall of cold stone, his body bruised and aching from the beating his captors had given him 3 days prior. A small barred window near the ceiling let in a sliver of gray daylight, the only measure he had of time passing. A guard he did not recognize slid a bowl of thin gruel through the bars of his cell door, refusing to meet his eyes. "Where is Draven?" Corwin asked, his voice rough from disuse. "The new king does not answer to prisoners," the guard said, and turned to leave. "My sons," Corwin said, and something in his tone, some final desperate thread of hope, made the guard pause despite himself. "Were their bodies found in the fire? Tell me the truth." The guard hesitated a long moment, glancing back toward the corridor as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "No bodies," he said finally, quietly. "Not that I've heard, but that doesn't mean they lived. The fire took plenty that nobody ever found." He left before Corwin could ask anything further, the sound of his boots fading down the stone corridor, and Corwin was left alone with the small, fragile thing that had just been planted in his chest. Not bodies. It was not proof of life. It was barely even proof of hope. But after 3 days of believing his entire family had been erased in a single night, it was enough to keep him breathing. He spent the following hours, and then the following days, turning that fragment of information over in his mind like a stone, worn smooth by constant handling. His sons might be alive, somewhere beyond these walls, in a world that no longer belonged to him. Cale and Finn might still be drawing breath, and if that was true, then he owed it to them, and to Aveline's memory, to survive whatever came next. To endure. He began, in the quiet hours of his imprisonment, to plan. Back in the forest, dawn broke gray and cold over the rocky overhang, where Elira and the 2 boys had sheltered through the storm. She woke stiff and shivering, her arms still wrapped protectively around both children, and for a moment, in the half-light before full consciousness returned, she allowed herself to simply feel the weight of them against her, warm and alive and breathing. Then Finn stirred, and Cale's eyes opened, sharp and alert as always, and the day's survival began again in earnest. "We need to find people," Elira said that morning, as she divided the last of their bread between the three of them. Not the castle, not anyone who might know your faces, but somewhere with walls, and food, and safety, until we can decide what comes next. Do you know somewhere like that? Kale asked. Elira thought of a place she had heard about only in whispers among the other kitchen staff, a village of Omegas who lived apart from the main packed territories, self-sufficient and quiet, unremarkable enough that Draven's forces might never think to search there. She had never been there herself. She did not even know if the stories about it were entirely true, but it was the only thread of hope she had to follow, and in a forest full of enemies and uncertainty, one thread was more than enough to build a plan around. I think I might, she said, and began leading the boys southward, toward a horizon neither of them could yet see, carrying with her the fragile, stubborn hope that somewhere beyond these trees, a door might open for two lost princes and the maid who refused to let them fall. The village had no name that appeared on any map Elira had ever seen, and that, she came to understand, was precisely the point. It took them 6 more days of walking to find it, 6 days of dwindling food and increasing exhaustion, 6 days in which Elira's shoes wore through at the soles, and Finn had to be carried more often than he walked, and Kale grew quieter with each passing mile, as though he were slowly folding inward to conserve whatever strength he had left. They ate what Elira could forage, drank from streams when they found them, and slept wherever shelter presented itself, always moving, always putting distance between themselves and the smoke that still seemed to cling to the edges of Elira's memory. She found the village by following a trail of smoke rising thin and careful above the tree line, the kind of smoke a person built when they did not want to be easily seen. When they finally stepped into the clearing, Elira felt Kale's hand tighten in hers, and she understood his caution. A dozen simple homes stood arranged in a loose circle, built from timber and stone, gardens tucked between them, and every single face that turned to look at the 3 strangers, who had stumbled out of the trees, belonged to a woman. An elder stepped forward from the nearest doorway, tall and gray-haired, her eyes moving over Elira's ragged appearance and the 2 exhausted children at her side, with an assessment that felt both careful and not unkind. You're a long way from anywhere, the elder said. Her name, Elira would soon learn, was Marin, and she had led this village of Omegas for over 20 years, ever since fleeing a mate who had treated her as property rather than partner, and finding, in the years since, that a community built entirely by women who refused to be owned could survive quite well without any alpha's protection at all. We need shelter, Elira said, too tired to attempt anything but the plain truth. Just for a little while. I can work. I can pay you back in labor, whatever you need. Marin's gaze moved to the 2 boys, lingering a moment longer than seemed casual. Kale stood straight, despite his exhaustion, chin lifted in a way that Elira had begun to recognize as a habit bred into him since birth, the posture of someone who had been taught, even at 5 years old, that he was meant to lead rather than follow. It was not a posture easily hidden, even in rags, even half-starved. Those are not ordinary children, Marin said quietly, for Elira's ears alone. Elira felt her heart drop, certain in that instant that she had led the boys into another kind of danger entirely, that this stranger would turn them away, or worse, recognize exactly who they were, and see an opportunity in that recognition. But Marin's expression held no threat in it, only a weary kind of understanding. Whatever happened, Marin said, and whoever they are, they're hungry and cold, and that's enough reason for me. But you'll need to give them different names before anyone else in this village sees their faces. Word travels, even out here, especially out here. Elira nodded, grateful beyond words, and that same evening, over a small fire and the first proper meal any of them had eaten in nearly 2 weeks, she knelt in front of the boys and explained, as gently as she could, what needed to happen. From now on, when anyone asks your names, you're not Kale and Finn anymore, she said. You're going to be Kai and Ren. Can you remember that? It's very important. Kale, or Kai now, frowned at this, turning the request over with the seriousness he brought to everything. Why do we have to hide who we are? Because who you are is dangerous right now, Elira said. Not because there's anything wrong with you, because there are people out there who would hurt you if they knew. Someday, when it's safe, you can be Kale again. I promise. But for now, we need to keep you both invisible." He accepted this with the grave nod of a child forced to grow up far too quickly, and Finn, not fully understanding the weight of what was being asked, simply repeated Ren a few times under his breath, testing the shape of it in his mouth, until it became, in his 3-year-old mind, simply another game to be played. The village gave them a small home at the edge of the clearing, one that had stood empty since its previous occupant had passed the winter before, and slowly, over the following weeks, Elira began to build something that almost resembled a life. She traded her labor for their keep, working in the communal gardens, helping repair thatched roofs before the coming winter, learning skills she had never needed within the walls of a castle kitchen. The other women of the village, cautious at first, gradually warmed to her quiet diligence and her fierce, obvious devotion to the 2 boys in her care. "You're not their mother," one of the younger women, a woman named Scylla, observed one evening as they sat together, shelling beans by lamplight. It was not an accusation, simply an observation, offered with the particular bluntness common to a community where pretense served little purpose. "No," Elira agreed. "I'm not. But you'd die for them." Elira considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, weighing it against the memory of that first terrible night, the fire and the smoke, and the small hand gripping hers in the dark. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." Scylla nodded, as though this answer confirmed something she had already suspected, and said nothing more on the subject, though from that evening forward, she made a point of setting aside a little extra of whatever she had, a warmer blanket, a spare pair of shoes, quietly leaving them at Elira's door without ever being asked. The boys, meanwhile, began to adjust to their strange new existence in the ways that only children can, with a resilience that both comforted and quietly broke Elira's heart in equal measure. Finn, too young to fully hold on to memories of the castle, adapted quickly, chasing chickens through the village clearing and learning to climb the low branches of the apple trees that grew near the eastern fence. Kale adjusted more slowly, more deliberately, watching everything and everyone with the same careful assessment Elira had first noticed in the nursery on the night of the fire. He did not play the way other children played. He observed, and he questioned, and he remembered. "Do you think my father is alive?" he asked Elira one night, months into their new life, as she tucked a blanket around him and Finn in the small bed they shared. Elira had wondered the same thing herself, countless times, though she had no way of knowing the answer. The rumors that reached even this hidden village, carried by traders who passed occasionally along the forest's edge, spoke of a new king ruling Blackthorn territory now, a king named Draven who had risen from betrayal and blood. They spoke nothing of King Corwin at all, as though he had simply ceased to exist, and Elira did not know whether that silence meant death or something else entirely. "I don't know," she said honestly, because she had decided early on that these boys deserved honesty from her, even when the truth was uncertain and difficult. "But I know that you're alive, and Finn is alive, and that matters more than anything else right now." Kale was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the low timber ceiling above their bed. "If he is alive," he said finally, "do you think he's looking for us?" "I think," Elira said carefully, "that any father who loved his sons as much as I believe your father loved you would never stop looking, no matter how long it took." She did not know, when she spoke those words, how true they would prove to be. Somewhere beyond the forest, beyond the borders of the only home these boys had ever known, a broken and imprisoned king was, at that very moment, beginning to plan an escape that would take years to fully realize, driven by nothing but the same fragile hope Elira had just described. Neither of them knew of the other's determination. Neither of them could have imagined how many years would pass, how much both father and sons would change, before their paths would finally, painfully, cross again. For now, in the hidden village that existed on no map, 3 strangers who had become, in every way that mattered, a family, settled into the rhythm of survival, unaware that their quiet existence was merely the calm center of a much larger storm still gathering strength in the world beyond the trees. The dungeon beneath Blackthorn Castle had a rhythm to it, and King Corwin Vale had learned every beat of that rhythm across the long months of his imprisonment. He knew the sound of the guard shift changing at dawn and again at dusk. He knew which of his jailers could be reasoned with and which could not. He knew the particular creak of the door at the end of the corridor that meant someone important was approaching, and he had learned, above all, the value of patience, a virtue that had never come easily to a man who had once commanded armies with a single word. Draven visited him rarely, and always alone, as though some part of him could not bear to let his own men witness whatever passed between himself and the king he had betrayed. "You could make this easier on yourself," Draven said, on one such visit, standing just beyond the reach of Corwin's chains, though the distance was hardly necessary given how weak the king had become. "Acknowledge my claim publicly. Tell the pack you step aside willingly. I would grant you a comfortable exile somewhere far from here. A quiet life. It is more than most fallen kings are offered." "You murdered my mate," Corwin said, his voice flat and cold, "and you ask me to make things easier for you." Something flickered across Draven's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I did not order Aveline's death," he said. "That was never part of the plan. She chose to fight rather than surrender, and my men responded as trained soldiers respond to armed resistance. I take no pleasure in it." "And my sons," Corwin said. "Do you take pleasure in hunting children through a forest?" "I take no pleasure in any of this," Draven said, and for a moment, something almost like the man Corwin had once trusted seemed to surface behind his eyes. "But a kingdom cannot be built on half measures, Corwin. You taught me that yourself, years ago, though I doubt you remember saying it." He left without another word, and Corwin sat alone in the dark, turning the exchange over in his mind, the way he turned over every scrap of information his jailers let slip. Draven had not confirmed his sons were dead. In 11 months of imprisonment, across dozens of similar conversations, Draven had never once claimed to possess proof of their deaths. He spoke always in careful evasions, in phrases that left room for uncertainty, and Corwin had begun to suspect that this uncertainty was not accidental. Perhaps Draven genuinely did not know what had become of the two princes. Perhaps, somewhere beyond these walls, Cale and Finn were still alive, still hidden, still waiting for a father who had promised, in the last calm moments before the fire began, that he would always protect them. That thought alone kept him breathing through the worst of his imprisonment, through the cold winter nights when the stone floor of his cell seemed to draw the very life from his bones, through the long stretches of silence when no jailer came at all, and he was left to wonder if he had simply been forgotten, left to waste away in the dark until his body finally gave out. He began, slowly and carefully, to study his captors. Not all of Draven's guards shared their new king's conviction. Some had served the Vale bloodline for decades, sworn oaths to Corwin's father before him, and Corwin began to watch for the small signs of hesitation in their eyes, the moments when a guard's hand lingered a beat too long before turning the key, the rare instances when a bowl of food arrived slightly more generous than regulations required. It was nearly 2 years into his imprisonment before he found the man who would eventually help him escape. Garrick had served as a castle guard since before Corwin was born, a quiet, unremarkable man who had never risen to any position of particular importance, and who had, for that very reason, been kept on under Draven's new regime without much scrutiny. He had known Corwin's father. He had stood watch on the night Corwin himself was born, and he had watched, over the months of Corwin's imprisonment, with a growing discomfort that he finally could not suppress any longer. "The new king grows more paranoid by the season," Garrick said one evening, sliding a bowl through the bars with slightly more care than usual. "He sees traitors in every shadow now, even among his own men." "Does he see one in you?" Corwin asked quietly. Garrick did not answer directly, but something in his silence spoke volumes, and from that evening forward, small conversations began to pass between them, careful and slow, each testing the boundaries of trust, with the caution of men who understood exactly what discovery would cost them both. It took another full year of careful planning before Garrick finally worked up the courage to act. By then, Corwin had learned every guard rotation, every gap in the dungeon's security, every weakness in a system that had grown complacent after 2 years without incident. On a moonless night in late autumn, nearly 3 years after the fire that had destroyed everything Corwin once held dear, Garrick unlocked the cell door, and pressed a folded set of plain clothes and a small knife into the former king's trembling hands. "There's a horse waiting beyond the eastern gate," Garrick whispered. "I can give you an hour before the next guard shift discovers you're gone. After that, I can't protect you. I can't protect myself either, if it comes to that." Corwin looked at the man who had risked everything he had for a king who could offer him nothing in return. No reward, no guarantee of safety, nothing but the fragile hope that doing the right thing still mattered in a kingdom that had forgotten what right and wrong even meant anymore. "Why?" Corwin asked simply. "Because your father gave me my position, when no one else would," Garrick said. "Because I swore an oath, and I've spent 3 years watching men break oaths all around me, and I decided I'd rather die keeping mine than live having broken it." There was no time for anything more than a grateful nod. Corwin changed into the plain clothes, concealed the knife, and followed Garrick through corridors he had once walked as a king, and now moved through as a fugitive in his own castle. They avoided the main halls, cutting instead through the same servant passages that Elira had used to carry his sons to safety 3 years earlier, though Corwin did not know this, could not have known it, and the strange symmetry of his escape route would remain, forever, one of the quiet ironies of his story. The horse was waiting exactly where Garrick had promised, tethered in a stand of trees just beyond the castle's eastern wall. Corwin mounted with the stiff, unpracticed movements of a man whose body had spent 3 years chained to a stone floor, and he looked back once at the castle that had been his home, now looming dark and unfamiliar against the night sky. "Thank you," he said to Garrick, who stood watching from the shadow of the wall. "Find your sons," Garrick said simply. "Whatever else happens, find them." Corwin rode into the darkness with nothing but a stolen horse, a small knife, and a fragile, 3-year-old hope to guide him. He did not know where to begin looking. He did not know if Cale and Finn were even still alive, or if the trail Draven's men had lost so long ago had gone cold beyond any hope of following. He knew only that he could not stop, could not rest, could not allow himself even a moment of doubt, because doubt was a luxury a man in his position could no longer afford. He was no longer a king. He had no throne, no army, no name that meant anything beyond the borders of a kingdom that now belonged to another man entirely. He was simply a father, broken and desperate, riding into the night in search of the only thing that still gave his life any meaning at all. Behind him, Blackthorn Castle grew smaller against the horizon, its torches flickering like distant, indifferent stars, and ahead of him stretched a world he no longer recognized, filled with dangers he could not yet predict, and, somewhere within it, if fate proved even slightly merciful, 2 sons who had grown 3 years older without him, waiting, whether they knew it or not, for the day their father would finally come to find them. Corwin's freedom, hard-won as it was, came with no map to follow and no clear trail to chase. He spent his first weeks beyond the castle walls simply learning how to survive as an ordinary man, a skill his years as king had never required of him. He sold Garrick's horse in a distant market town, unwilling to risk being recognized while riding an animal that bore the castle's stable brand, and used the coin to buy plain traveling clothes and enough food to last several days on foot. He grew a beard he never would have permitted himself as king, let his hair grow long and unkempt, and adopted the quiet, unassuming manner of a man with nothing to offer the world, and nothing to fear from it either. It was, he came to realize, a useful kind of invisibility, one that Elira had discovered by instinct 3 years earlier, and that he was only now learning by necessity. His search began with rumors, the same currency that had carried whispers of his son's survival to him, even within his prison cell. He traveled from village to village along the forest's edge, listening carefully in taverns and market squares for any mention of a woman who had appeared with 2 young boys in the months following the fall of Blackthorn Castle. Most rumors led nowhere. Some led to families who bore no resemblance whatsoever to the sons he remembered. A few led to dead ends, so thoroughly cold that he wondered, in his darkest moments, whether he was chasing nothing more than his own desperate hope. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Every village he searched and found empty of answers only strengthened his resolve to search the next one, and the one after that, for as many years as it took. It was in his 2nd year of searching, in a modest trading town 2 days' journey from the forest's southern edge, that he finally heard something that felt different from the rumors that had come before. An old trader, weathered by decades on the road, mentioned almost in passing, while haggling over the price of dried meat, that he occasionally supplied goods to a hidden settlement deep in the forest, a community of Omegas who kept mostly to themselves and paid well for salt and iron tools they could not produce on their own. "Any children there?" Corwin asked, keeping his voice carefully casual, the way he had learned to ask such questions without revealing the desperation that lived beneath every syllable. The trader shrugged. "A few. There's 2 boys who always come running when I arrive, curious about whatever I've brought. Brothers, I think. Odd pair. The younger one's friendly enough, chatters your ear off. The older one just watches you, like he's deciding whether to trust you or not." Something in Corwin's chest tightened so sharply he had to steady himself against the trader's cart. "How old?" he asked. "The boys." "Couldn't say exactly. The older one's perhaps 8 or 9 now. Been a few years since I first started that route." 8 or 9. Cale would be 8 now, if he had lived. The math lined up with a precision that felt almost too perfect to trust, and Corwin knew better, after 2 years of chasing false hope, than to let himself believe too quickly. But something about this particular rumor refused to release its grip on him. "Their names?" he asked. "Do you know their names?" "Kai and Ren, I believe," the trader said. "Raised by a woman who isn't their mother, though you'd never guess it watching the 3 of them together. Fiercely protective, that one. Nearly took my head off once when I made an offhand joke about the older boy's manners." Kai and Ren. Not Cale and Finn, but close enough, near enough, that a father's instinct recognized the shape of his son's names, hidden inside the disguise, the way a familiar melody can still be recognized, even when played in an unfamiliar key. "Can you take me there?" Corwin asked, and something in his voice must have carried more weight than he intended, because the trader's expression shifted, grew wary. "That village doesn't take kindly to strangers showing up uninvited," the trader said. "Especially strangers asking pointed questions about children who aren't theirs to ask about." "Please," Corwin said, and the single word carried 3 years of imprisonment, of grief, of a hope so carefully guarded it had nearly calcified into something else entirely. "I have reason to believe those boys might be family of mine. Lost family. I only want to see them safe." The trader studied him for a long moment, weighing whatever he saw in this ragged, bearded stranger's face against decades of instinct, honed by a life spent reading people across a bargaining table. Whatever he found there must have satisfied some measure of trust, because he finally nodded, slowly. "I make the trip again in a fortnight," he said. "I'll take you as far as the village edge. What happens after that is between you and them. I'll not vouch for a stranger to people who've trusted me with their privacy for years." "That's more than fair," Corwin said, and felt, for the first time in nearly 3 years, something that almost resembled hope taking root, instead of merely surviving on scraps. The fortnight that followed was the longest and shortest of his entire life, each day dragging with unbearable slowness, while somehow, all at once, the appointed departure date arrived before he felt ready to face whatever waited for him at the end of the journey. He traveled with the trader's cart through forest paths that grew steadily narrower and more overgrown, the kind of trail deliberately left unmaintained to discourage casual travelers, and with every mile, Corwin's chest grew tighter, with a mixture of hope and terror, so completely intertwined, he could no longer separate the two. What if the boys did not remember him? What if 3 years had erased every trace of their father from their young minds, leaving him nothing but a stranger's face to 2 children who had built an entirely new life without him? What if this was, after everything, another false trail, another cruel coincidence, dressed up as hope, only to collapse the moment he arrived and found children who bore no true connection to him at all? The trader's cart finally rolled to a stop at the edge of a clearing, and Corwin climbed down on legs that felt unsteady beneath him, staring at the collection of simple homes arranged in their loose circle, smoke rising from chimneys, gardens tended with obvious care. "This is as far as I go," the trader said. "The path continues straight ahead. Someone will meet you before you reach the first house. They always do." Corwin nodded his thanks and began walking, each step feeling heavier than the last, until a figure emerged from between two of the homes to block his path. A woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, studying him with the immediate, unmistakable wariness of someone accustomed to protecting a community from outside threats. "You're not one of our regular traders," Marin said, her voice carrying an edge of warning beneath its calm surface. "No," Corwin said. "My name is Corwin. I have reason to believe there are two boys in this village who might be my sons. I was told they go by Kai and Ren." Marin's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, subtle and immediate, the reaction of someone who had been dreading exactly this conversation for years, and had, perhaps, always known it would eventually come. "And what proof do you have of that claim?" she asked carefully. Corwin had prepared for this question during every mile of the journey, but standing here now, facing the moment he had spent 3 years imagining, all his prepared words seemed to abandon him at once. He could offer no proof beyond his own certainty, no evidence beyond a father's instinct that refused to be silenced. "None," he admitted honestly. "Nothing but the fact that I have not stopped searching for them since the night my castle burned, and I will not stop searching, whether you let me see them today or not. I only ask for the chance to know, one way or another, if the hope I've carried for 3 years has any truth in it at all." Marin studied him for a long, silent moment, her eyes moving over his weathered face, his threadbare clothes, the particular quality of desperate hope that no amount of practiced calm could fully disguise. Whatever she found in that examination, it must have carried some weight, because she finally turned, gesturing for him to follow. "Wait here," she said, leading him to the edge of the clearing but no further. "I need to speak with someone first, someone who has protected those 2 boys with everything she has, and who deserves to be the one who decides what happens next." She left him standing at the edge of the village, his heart pounding so violently he could hear it in his own ears, and walked toward a small home at the far side of the clearing, where smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney, and where, though Corwin did not yet know it, the woman who had saved his sons' lives was about to face the moment she had quietly dreaded and hoped for in equal measure for 3 long years. Elira was kneading dough at her kitchen table when Marin's knock sounded at her door, and something in the particular rhythm of it, 3 quick raps followed by a pause, told her immediately that this was not an ordinary visit. "There's a man at the village edge," Marin said without preamble, once Elira had stepped outside, wiping flour from her hands. "Says his name is Corwin. Says he believes Kai and Ren might be his sons." The bowl of flour Elira had been carrying nearly slipped from her fingers. 3 years. 3 years of building a quiet, careful life in this hidden village. 3 years of watching the boys grow, of celebrating small victories and comforting small hurts, of loving them with a fierceness that had surprised even her, and now, in a single sentence, everything she had built stood poised on the edge of change. "Does he look like them?" Elira asked, her voice barely steady. Marin considered the question. "The older one, yes. Something in the set of his jaw, and there's a bearing to him, even ragged as he looks, that speaks of someone once accustomed to command. I've turned away plenty of false claimants over the years, drawn by whatever rumors travel with the traders. This one felt different." Elira closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself against a wave of emotion so complex, she could not have named all of its parts even if she had tried. Relief, that Kale's hope, spoken so many nights ago in the darkness of their small bed, might finally be answered. Fear, that this stranger might take the boys from the only stability they had known, and disappear with them, into a world Elira could no longer follow them into. And beneath both of those feelings, something quieter and more painful. A grief for the ending of a chapter she had never expected to love as much as she had come to. "I need to see him," she said finally, "before the boys know anything. I need to know for certain." Marin nodded, understanding without needing further explanation, and led her toward the village edge where Corwin still stood waiting, his eyes fixed anxiously on the path ahead. Elira recognized him the moment she saw him, though 3 years and considerable hardship had reshaped his face into something far removed from the distant, golden figure she remembered glimpsing across the great hall on the night of the Blood Moon Festival. Gone was the polished bearing of a king, surrounded by wealth and certainty. In his place stood a thin, weathered man, with hollow eyes and a beard that spoke of years spent surviving rather than ruling. But something in his face remained unmistakably, achingly familiar, the same sharp jaw and steady gaze that Elira had watched develop, piece by piece, in his eldest son, over the years since the fire. "You're the maid," Corwin said, his voice catching slightly, "the one who disappeared with my sons the night of the fire. I remember hearing your name mentioned, once or twice, though I confess I never gave it the attention it deserved." "Elira," she said. "My name is Elira." "Elira," he repeated, as though testing the weight of a name he owed his entire remaining hope to. "Are they alive? Please, I need to know. Are my sons alive?" Elira looked at this broken, desperate man standing before her, a man who had clearly suffered greatly in the years since his kingdom fell, and she felt the last of her hesitation dissolve beneath the simple, undeniable truth of his grief. "Yes," she said, "they're alive. Both of them. They're here, in this village, and they're safe, and they're growing into two remarkable boys." Corwin's legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank to his knees in the dirt path, his hands covering his face as 3 years of grief and hope and desperate uncertainty finally broke free all at once. Elira watched him, this man who had once ruled an entire kingdom, now reduced to weeping openly in front of a servant he barely knew, and she felt her own eyes fill with tears she had not allowed herself to shed in front of anyone since the night the castle burned. "Thank you," Corwin said, when he finally found his voice again, looking up at her with an expression of gratitude so raw it seemed almost too large for his face to contain. "I don't know how to begin to thank you. You saved them. You saved my entire family when I could not." "I did what anyone would have done," Elira said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew them to be untrue. Not anyone would have done what she had done. Not anyone would have risked everything, given up every chance at an ordinary life, for 2 children who were not their own. "No," Corwin said, rising unsteadily to his feet. "Not anyone. I've spent 3 years searching villages and towns across half this territory, and I've met plenty of people who would have turned my sons away, or worse, seen an opportunity in their identity to sell to the highest bidder. You didn't do what anyone would have done. You did something extraordinary." Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, unaccustomed as she was to being seen so directly, so completely. And she busied herself instead with the practical matters that still needed addressing. "Before you see them," she said, "I need you to understand something. They don't remember much of their life before the fire. Finn, Ren now, was too young to hold on to real memories of you at all. And Kale, Kai, remembers enough to have built up questions he's carried for 3 years, wondering if his father was even alive. This will not be simple for either of them. I need you to be patient." Corwin nodded, though the eagerness in his eyes suggested patience might prove a difficult virtue to summon after 3 years of desperate searching. "Whatever they need," he said, "however long it takes, I only want the chance to be their father again, in whatever form that takes now." Elira led him slowly through the village, past curious glances from the other women who had come to know her and the boys well over the years, toward the small home at the clearing's edge where the boys were, at that moment, entirely unaware that the day that would reshape the rest of their lives had already begun. She found Kale sitting on the front step, carving a small piece of wood into the rough shape of a bird, a skill one of the village elders had taught him the previous winter. Finn was nearby, chasing one of the village chickens with the boundless energy of a 6-year-old who had never known any other home. "Kai," Elira said, her voice carefully steady despite the storm of emotion still churning beneath her calm exterior. "There's someone here to meet you." Kale looked up from his carving, his sharp eyes moving immediately to the stranger standing beside Elira, taking in every detail with the same careful assessment he brought to everything unfamiliar. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as though some deeply buried instinct had recognized a truth his conscious mind had not yet caught up to. "Who is he?" Kale asked, though his voice had gone quiet in a way that suggested he already suspected the answer. Elira knelt beside him, taking his small hand in hers, the same way she had taken it on the night of the fire 3 years earlier. "Kale," she said, using his real name for the first time in years, "this is your father." The wooden bird slipped from Kale's fingers, and fell forgotten to the dirt. For a long moment, no one moved. Cale stared up at the man standing before him, searching his face for some trace of memory, some flicker of recognition that might confirm what Alira had just told him. Corwin, for his part, seemed unable to speak at all, drinking in the sight of his eldest son, as though afraid the boy might vanish if he so much as blinked. "You don't remember me," Corwin said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "That's all right. You were only 5. I wouldn't expect you to remember." "I remember a little," Cale said slowly, rising from the step, his eyes never leaving Corwin's face. "I remember someone tall, who used to lift me onto his shoulders. I remember a voice. I thought maybe I made it up, over the years. I thought maybe I wanted it so badly that my mind just invented it." "You didn't invent it," Corwin said. "That was me. I used to carry you on my shoulders through the castle gardens, and you would laugh so hard you'd nearly fall, and I'd have to grip your ankles tight enough to leave marks." Something in Cale's carefully guarded expression cracked, just slightly, at this small, specific detail, a memory too particular to have been invented by a stranger, seeking to deceive him. "Where have you been?" he asked, and the question carried an edge sharper than an 8-year-old's voice should have been capable of producing. 3 years. Where were you for 3 years while we didn't know if you were alive or dead?" Corwin absorbed the question without flinching, understanding instinctively that his son deserved nothing less than complete honesty, however painful. "I was imprisoned," he said. "In the dungeons beneath our old castle. Draven kept me alive but chained, for 3 years, until a loyal guard helped me escape. I searched for you and your brother from the moment I was free. Every village, every rumor, every scrap of hope I could find. I never stopped searching, Cale, not for a single day." Cale studied his father's face for a long, searching moment, and Alira, watching from beside them, could see the boy weighing this information against 3 years of carefully guarded hope, testing it for weaknesses the way he tested everything unfamiliar before allowing himself to trust it. "I believed you were dead," Cale admitted finally, his voice dropping to something quieter and more vulnerable than the guarded tone he had used moments before. "I stopped hoping, after the first year. It hurt less to stop hoping." "I understand," Corwin said, and something in his expression suggested he genuinely did understand, having weathered the exact same battle within his own heart across the very same years. "You don't owe me your trust simply because I'm your father. I know that. I only ask for the chance to earn it back, however long that takes." It was Finn, drawn by the unusual stillness that had fallen over the yard, who broke the tension entirely. He wandered over from his abandoned chicken chase, wiping dirt from his hands onto his trousers, and looked up at the stranger with the open, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to be cautious of the world. "Who are you?" Finn asked simply. Corwin knelt down to meet the boy at eye level, his hands trembling slightly as he did. "My name is Corwin," he said gently. "I'm your father, Finn." Finn tilted his head, considering this information with the same casual acceptance he brought to most new facts about the world. "Alira says I had a father before," he said, "but I don't remember him. Are you nice?" Despite the weight of the moment, something in the boy's simple, direct question startled a broken, genuine laugh out of Corwin, the first real laugh he had allowed himself in 3 years. "I hope so," he said. "I'll certainly try to be." "Okay," Finn said, with the easy, uncomplicated acceptance of a child who had not yet learned to carry the same wariness his older brother wore like armor. And he reached out and took Corwin's hand, as simply as if he had been doing so his entire life. "Do you want to see my chicken? I named her Bramble. She's very fast." Corwin looked down at his youngest son's small hand in his, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years, finally, gradually, began to loosen. Over the following days, Corwin remained at the edge of the village, given a small guest home by Marin, who watched the reunion unfold with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough of the world to know that even happy endings required patience and caution in equal measure. He did not push, he did not demand. He simply showed up, day after day, learning the small details of his sons' lives that he had missed across 3 lost years, letting Finn drag him toward every new discovery the village had to offer, while allowing Cale the space to approach him on his own terms and at his own pace. It was Alira who bridged the gap that remained hardest to close, sitting with Cale in the quiet evenings after Corwin had returned to his guest home, gently reminding the boy of the father he had once loved before fear and loss had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. "He's not the same man he was before the fire," she told Cale one evening, as they sat together on the front step where Corwin had first appeared days earlier. "None of us are the same as we were before, but that doesn't mean the love underneath has changed. Sometimes it just takes time to find your way back to trusting it again." "What if I let myself trust him, and then I lose him again?" Heel said, voicing the fear he had clearly been carrying since the moment his father first appeared. "What if it's easier to just keep him at a distance, so it doesn't hurt as much if something happens?" Alira considered the question carefully, understanding that whatever answer she gave would shape how this reunion unfolded for years to come. "I think," she said slowly, "that keeping people at a distance doesn't actually protect you from losing them. It just means you lose the chance to have them close while you still can. Your father searched for 3 years, Cale. Through prison, through danger, through every kind of hardship. He didn't give up on you. I don't think you need to be afraid of giving him the chance to prove that all over again." Cale was quiet for a long time, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange above the village clearing. "You never gave up on us either," he said finally. "Not once, in 3 years." "No," Alira agreed. "I never did." "Will you still be here?" Cale asked, and something in his voice suggested this question had been weighing on him even more heavily than the questions surrounding his father's return. "Once he takes us wherever we're going next. Will you come too?" It was a question Alira had not yet allowed herself to consider fully, so focused had she been on simply surviving each day as it came for the past 3 years. The thought of a future without these two boys, without the rhythm of their small home and the fierce, protective love that had come to define her entire existence, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no clear sense of what lay below. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "That's not entirely my decision to make. But I do know that wherever you go, I want you to know you'll always matter to me. That will never change, no matter what happens next." Cale leaned his head against her shoulder, a small, simple gesture of trust that meant more to Alira than any words could have expressed. And together, they watched the sun disappear below the tree line, both of them carrying, in their own separate ways, the same uncertain hope for whatever the coming days might bring. Word of a hidden village sheltering 2 Omega boys did not stay contained within the forest forever, and it was Garrick, the very guard who had helped Corwin escape 3 years earlier, who first brought word of the danger now gathering against them. He arrived at the village on a borrowed horse, exhausted from days of hard travel, having tracked Corwin's movements through the same network of rumors and traitors that Corwin himself had followed to find his sons. Marin, wary as always of unfamiliar faces, nearly turned him away at the village edge until he spoke Corwin's name and explained his connection to the former king. "Draven's spies have picked up the same trail I followed," Garrick told Corwin urgently, once they were seated together in the small guest home, Alira listening nearby with growing alarm. "A trader who supplies this village was questioned in the capital 2 weeks ago. He didn't give up the location, not directly, but Draven's men are clever and persistent. It's only a matter of time before they narrow the search enough to find this place." Corwin felt the fragile peace of the past several weeks crack beneath the weight of this news. "How much time?" he asked. "Weeks, perhaps. A month if we're fortunate," Garrick said. "Draven has grown increasingly paranoid over the years, more convinced than ever that your survival threatens the legitimacy of his claim to the throne. If he learns your sons are alive, and that you've found them, he won't hesitate to send forces to eliminate the threat entirely. All 3 of you, and likely this entire village along with you." Alira felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at the thought of the danger she had unknowingly brought to Marin's community, a community that had sheltered her and the boys for 3 years, without asking for anything beyond her honest labor in return. "We have to leave," she said, "before Draven's men arrive. We can't put this village at risk any longer." "Where would we go?" Corwin asked, though even as he spoke, Alira could see him already turning the question over, searching for options within a landscape he understood far better than she did, having grown up navigating the political territories that surrounded his former kingdom. "There's a neighboring pack territory to the east," Garrick offered. Ruled by a pack that has never fully recognized Draven's claim to Blackthorn's throne, Alpha Rowan Blackwell has been quietly gathering support against Draven for the past year, watching for the right moment to challenge his legitimacy. If you brought him proof that the true heirs still lived, proof he could rally support around, it might be enough to finally tip the balance against Draven's rule. Corwin considered this carefully. You're suggesting I use my sons as a political rallying point, he said slowly. Expose them to exactly the kind of danger we've spent 3 years protecting them from. I'm suggesting, Garrick said, that hiding forever was never truly an option. Not for the heirs to Blackthorn's throne. Draven will keep hunting, whether you run or whether you fight. The only question is whether you fight on your own terms, with allies at your back, or wait until he finds you cornered and unprepared. That evening, Corwin gathered Alira and both boys together in the small guest home, laying out everything Garrick had told him, with the same careful honesty he had promised Cale on the very first day of their reunion. I won't make this decision without all of you, he said, looking around the small circle of faces that had, in the space of a few short weeks, come to represent everything he had left in the world worth protecting. We can try to run further, deeper into hiding, and hope we stay ahead of Draven's search. Or we can travel to Alpha Blackwell's territory and ask for his support in reclaiming what was taken from us. Both paths carry real danger. I need to know what all of you think, especially you, Cale. You're old enough now to understand what's at stake. Cale sat quietly for a long moment, and Alira could see him weighing the decision with the same careful gravity he brought to everything, a habit born of 3 years spent learning that safety could never be taken for granted. If we keep running, Cale said finally, we'll spend our whole lives hiding. Being Kai and Ren instead of who we really are. I don't want that anymore. I want to be able to say my real name without being afraid of who might be listening. That's a brave answer, Corwin said. But bravery alone doesn't guarantee safety. This path could put you both in far greater danger than 3 more years of hiding ever would. I know, Cale said, and something in his young voice carried a weight and certainty that made him sound, in that moment, far older than his 8 years. But Alira taught me something. These past 3 years, she taught me that surviving isn't the same as really living. I don't want to just survive anymore. I want us to actually be free. Alira felt tears sting her eyes at hearing her own quiet philosophy, one she had never explicitly voiced, but had lived by every single day since the fire, reflected back to her through the mouth of a child she had raised as her own. Corwin looked at her then, something like gratitude and wonder mixing together in his expression. You taught him that, he said softly. I only tried to give them a life worth having, Alira said, even in hiding. I never wanted them to simply exist. I wanted them to actually live. Finn, who had been listening quietly to the entire conversation, with the solemn attention he reserved for moments he sensed were important, even if he did not fully grasp every detail, finally spoke up. Will Alira come with us? He asked, to the new place? I don't want to go anywhere without her. Every eye in the room turned to Alira, and she felt the weight of the question settle over her with the same complicated mixture of hope and uncertainty she had been carrying since Corwin's arrival weeks earlier. That depends on what everyone wants, she said carefully, unwilling to presume a place for herself in whatever future these decisions might shape. I want you there, Cale said immediately, without hesitation. You saved us. You raised us. Whatever happens next, it doesn't make sense without you. Corwin nodded in firm agreement. I meant what I said the day I found you, he told Alira. I owe you a debt I could never fully repay. But beyond any debt, my sons love you, and I've watched, these past weeks, how deeply that love runs in both directions. Whatever we decide, wherever this path leads, I want you there too, Alira. Not as a servant, as family. The word landed on Alira with unexpected weight, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by an offer she had never allowed herself to hope for across 3 years of quiet, unacknowledged sacrifice. Then I'll come, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Wherever this path leads, I'll be there. The decision made, they spent the following days preparing for departure, saying difficult goodbyes to the village that had sheltered them for 3 crucial years. Marin embraced Alira with the fierce, wordless understanding of two women who had weathered hardship together, and the other villagers pressed small gifts into the boys' hands, tokens of a community that had come to love these two children as though they were their own. "You'll always have a place here," Marin told them all, as they prepared to depart at dawn, "should you ever need to disappear again." "I hope we won't need to," Corwin said, "but I'll never forget what this village did for my family. Whatever becomes of Blackthorn's future, this place will always have my gratitude and my protection." As they rode away from the village that had kept two lost princes safe through the darkest years of their young lives, Elira looked back one final time at the collection of simple homes disappearing behind the tree line, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, a genuine and uncertain hope that the family she had built out of fire and desperation might finally be moving towards something resembling a future worth having. Ahead of them lay Alpha Blackwell's territory, and beyond that, an uncertain confrontation with the man who had stolen everything from them. But for the first time since the night Blackthorn Castle burned, they faced that uncertain future together, as a family bound not merely by blood, but by 3 years of shared survival and a love that no amount of hardship had managed to break. Alpha Rowan Blackwell's territory lay a full week's journey east of the hidden village, across terrain that grew steadily more populated and more dangerous the closer they came to lands still contested between rival pack loyalties. Corwin insisted on traveling with extreme caution, avoiding main roads, keeping the boys' identities concealed beneath simple traveling clothes and the same false names they had carried for 3 years, until they were safely within territory that had never bent its knee to Draven's rule. Blackwell's stronghold, when they finally arrived, bore little resemblance to the golden opulence of Blackthorn Castle in its former glory. It was a practical, fortified place, built for defense rather than display, and Alpha Rowan Blackwell himself, a broad-shouldered man in his middle years with a reputation for careful, deliberate judgment, received them with a wariness that matched the caution Corwin had shown throughout their journey. "You understand," Blackwell said, once they were seated in his private council chamber, Elira and the boys waiting in an adjoining room while the two men spoke. "That, simply claiming to be Corwin Vale, means very little to me. I've had 3 imposters attempt similar claims over the past year alone, each hoping to use your name and your son's potential existence to draw resources and support they had no legitimate right to." "I understand your caution," Corwin said. "What proof would satisfy you?" Blackwell studied him for a long moment. "There are those in my court who served alongside your father, years ago, before either of us held our current positions. If you are truly who you claim to be, they will recognize you, regardless of how prison and hardship have changed your appearance. And if your sons truly carry Blackthorn blood, certain marks and characteristics tend to run true in that bloodline, marks that would be difficult for any imposter to accurately replicate." The verification process that followed took the better part of a week, as elderly courtiers who remembered Corwin's father examined him carefully, asked probing questions about childhood details only the true king would know, and eventually, cautiously, confirmed his identity beyond reasonable doubt. Kale and Finn underwent similar scrutiny, and it was an old healer, one who had attended Corwin's own birth decades earlier, who finally confirmed what Blackwell needed to hear. "The boy," she said, examining a small, distinctive birthmark on Kale's shoulder that had been noted in the official birth records of every Vale heir for 6 generations, "carries the mark. There's no forging this. He is who his father claims him to be." Blackwell's demeanor shifted noticeably once the verification was complete, the wary caution giving way to something more genuinely welcoming. "Forgive my initial skepticism," he told Corwin, as they sat together once more in his council chamber. "But you understand the stakes. If I throw my support behind a false claim, I risk everything my pack has built. Now that your identity is confirmed, however, I am prepared to offer my full support in challenging Draven's illegitimate rule." Over the following weeks, Blackwell's stronghold became the center of a growing coalition, as word spread carefully and deliberately through networks of pack leaders who had never fully accepted Draven's claim to Blackthorn's throne. Many had simply lacked a clear alternative to rally behind, unwilling to risk open rebellion without a legitimate heir to support. Now, with proof that Corwin and his sons had survived, That legitimate alternative finally existed. Draven, for his part, did not remain ignorant of these developments for long. Spies within Blackwell's territory, though carefully rooted out over subsequent months, managed to carry word back to Blackthorn Castle before their exposure, and Draven's response came swiftly and with unmistakable intent. "He knows," Garrick reported grimly, "having traveled between territories to gather intelligence, and he's mobilizing forces. He means to strike before your coalition grows strong enough to challenge him directly." Corwin received this news in the same council chamber where his identity had first been confirmed. Alira seated beside him now as a permanent presence in these discussions, her insight into Draven's methods and mindset gathered from years of quiet observation as a servant within his court, proving unexpectedly valuable to the growing coalition's strategic planning. "He'll come for the boys first," Alira said, drawing on instincts sharpened by 3 years spent anticipating exactly this kind of threat. "Removing the legitimate heirs eliminates the foundation your entire coalition is built upon. Whatever defenses you're planning, protecting Kale and Finn needs to be the absolute priority." Blackwell nodded in agreement, already directing his commanders to reinforce the stronghold's defenses, particularly around the private quarters where the two princes were housed. "She's right," he said. Draven built his entire claim to power on a single night of decisive, ruthless action. He'll try the same approach again, if given the opportunity. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived not as the massive battle Corwin had feared, but as something more insidious and immediate. Draven, unwilling to risk an open military conflict he was not entirely certain of winning against Blackwell's gathering coalition, instead sent a small group of highly trained operatives with a single, focused mission: infiltrate the stronghold and eliminate the two princes before their existence could rally enough support to threaten his rule permanently. It was Kale, now approaching his 9th year and possessing an alertness sharpened by years of learning to notice what others missed, who first sensed something was wrong. "There's someone in the garden who doesn't belong there," he told Alira one evening as they walked together through the stronghold's grounds. "A man who claims to be one of the new stable hands, but he doesn't move like someone who spent his life around horses, and he watches the windows of our quarters far more than he watches anything else." Alira, trusting the instincts she had watched Kale develop and sharpen across years of careful observation, brought this concern immediately to Corwin and Blackwell's attention. A discreet investigation confirmed Kale's suspicions almost immediately, uncovering not 1 but 3 infiltrators who had worked their way into various positions throughout the stronghold over the preceding weeks, patiently waiting for an opportunity to strike. The confrontation that followed, when Blackwell's guards finally moved to apprehend the infiltrators, was swift and largely without the kind of prolonged danger that might have threatened the boys directly, thanks in large part to the early warning Kale's sharp observation had provided. But it confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how far Draven was prepared to go to eliminate the threat the surviving Vale heirs posed to his stolen throne. "This will not stop," Corwin said grimly, once the immediate danger had passed and the captured infiltrators had been questioned, confirming Draven's direct involvement in the plot. "He'll keep sending threats until either he succeeds or until his ability to threaten us is permanently removed. Then we stop waiting for him to make the next move," Blackwell said, his earlier caution finally giving way to decisive resolve. "The coalition has grown strong enough. It's time we brought this conflict to Draven's own doorstep, before he has the chance to threaten your family again." Alira, listening to these plans take shape, felt the familiar weight of fear settle over her at the thought of the boys she had protected for so many years, now standing at the center of an approaching conflict that could still, despite every precaution, take everything from them in a single terrible moment. But she also recognized, watching Kale's steady, watchful presence beside his father during these strategic discussions, that the boy who had once been a frightened 5-year-old hiding in a forest hollow had grown into someone capable of far more than simple survival. He had grown, across 3 years of hardship and a 4th year of uncertain reunion, into someone who might, one day soon, be ready to reclaim not just his father's throne, but the kind of just and thoughtful rule that Blackthorn Pack had lost the night Draven's betrayal first began. The march toward Blackthorn Castle began at the first true frost of autumn, nearly 5 years after the fire that had once destroyed everything Corwin Vale held dear. Alpha Blackwell's coalition had grown, over the preceding months, into a force large enough that Draven's remaining supporters within the pack had begun quietly withdrawing their loyalty, unwilling to stake their future on a ruler whose claim to power had never truly recovered from the revelation of his attempted attack on 2 innocent children. Corwin insisted, against Blackwell's initial objections, that Cale accompany the coalition on its approach toward the castle, though the boy would remain safely behind the front lines, protected by a dedicated contingent of guards. "He needs to be seen," Corwin explained, when Elira raised her own concerns about the wisdom of exposing Cale to such danger. "The pack needs to know their true heir stands ready to reclaim what was stolen from them, not hiding in some distant stronghold while others fight on his behalf. It's the difference between a coalition rallying around an idea and a coalition rallying around a living, breathing future they can actually believe in." Elira understood the political necessity of this reasoning, even as every protective instinct she had developed across 5 years of guarding these boys screamed against it. In the end, she insisted on accompanying the coalition herself, unwilling to let Cale face this final chapter of their long journey without her presence nearby, and Corwin, understanding exactly why she could not be persuaded otherwise, made no argument against it. Finn, at 8 years old, still young enough to be kept safely behind at Blackwell's stronghold, had made his own feelings on the matter known with the blunt honesty that had always characterized him. "I don't want to stay behind," he told Elira, on the morning of their departure, "but I understand why I have to. Just promise you'll bring Cale back safely, and Father too." "I promise," Elira told him, holding him close for a long moment before finally releasing him into the care of the stronghold's trusted staff. The coalition's approach toward Blackthorn Castle unfolded not as the massive, violent confrontation many had feared, but as something Draven himself had never adequately prepared for: a slow, inexorable collapse of his own support from within. Village after village along the coalition's path opened their gates willingly, their leaders having watched for years as Draven's rule grew increasingly paranoid and heavy-handed, desperate for any legitimate alternative to rally behind. By the time the coalition reached the outskirts of Blackthorn Castle itself, Draven's remaining forces had dwindled to a fraction of what they had once been, and even those who remained showed clear signs of wavering loyalty, unwilling to die defending a throne that increasingly few people believed he had any rightful claim to. Draven, watching from the castle's battlements as the coalition's forces gathered below, understood with growing clarity that the kingdom he had built through betrayal was crumbling beneath him, not through military defeat, but through the simple, undeniable fact that a legitimate heir stood ready to reclaim what had always rightfully belonged to him. The final confrontation, when it came, required no battle at all. Draven's own remaining guards, faced with the choice between defending an increasingly desperate and isolated ruler or standing aside to let justice finally run its course, chose the latter almost unanimously. Draven was taken into custody within his own throne room, the same room where he had once forced Corwin to his knees 5 years earlier, and this time it was Draven himself who knelt, stripped of the power he had stolen through betrayal and blood. "You could have simply asked for what you wanted," Corwin told him, standing over the man who had once called himself his brother, feeling not the vengeful satisfaction he might have expected after 5 years of imprisonment and loss, but something closer to a tired, sorrowful clarity. "I would have given you a position of honor, a voice in how this kingdom was governed. Instead, you chose betrayal, and it cost you everything you claimed to want." Draven said nothing in response, his earlier confidence and conviction finally, completely extinguished, and Corwin turned away from him without another word, understanding that whatever justice awaited his former friend was no longer his burden to personally deliver. That decision would belong to the reformed council of pack elders that Corwin intended to establish, a system of shared governance designed specifically to prevent any single person from ever again seizing absolute power through betrayal alone. The following months brought the slow, careful work of rebuilding a kingdom that had spent 5 years under a ruler more interested in maintaining power than governing wisely. Corwin reclaimed his throne, not with the same unquestioned absolute authority his family had held for generations, but with a new commitment to the kind of thoughtful, accountable leadership that his years of hardship had taught him truly mattered. Cale, now approaching his 10th year, began, under his father's careful guidance, to learn the responsibilities that would one day fall to him as the kingdom's future ruler, though Corwin made certain, at every step, that his son understood leadership as a responsibility to be earned through service, rather than a birthright to be claimed through blood alone. "You'll inherit this throne someday," Corwin told him, as they walked together through the rebuilt gardens of Blackthorn Castle. "But you'll inherit it because you've learned to deserve it, not simply because you were born to it. That's a lesson I only truly learned myself, after losing everything and having to build my way back." Finn, reunited with his family within the rebuilt castle walls, adjusted to his new life with the same easy resilience that had carried him through every previous change, quickly becoming a favorite among the castle's staff for his warm, curious nature and his complete lack of the guardedness that still occasionally shadowed his older brother's demeanor. And Elira, the quiet Omega maid who had once carried 2 frightened boys through a burning castle with nothing but instinct and determination to guide her, found herself, in the months following the coalition's victory, occupying a position within the rebuilt court that she could never have imagined for herself 5 years earlier. "You should have a formal title," Corwin told her one evening, as they sat together in the castle's private gardens, watching Finn chase fireflies across the lawn while Cale sat nearby, practicing careful, deliberate sword work under the guidance of one of Blackwell's trusted commanders. "Something that reflects everything you've done for this family, for this kingdom." "I never asked for a title," Elira said. "I only ever wanted the boys to be safe." "I know," Corwin said. "That's exactly why you deserve one. You never once acted out of ambition, or for personal gain. Everything you did purely out of love. That's rarer, and more valuable, than any crown I could offer you." Elira looked at this man beside her, so different now from the broken, desperate stranger who had appeared at the edge of a hidden village 5 years earlier, and found herself, not for the first time, marveling at how completely their lives had become intertwined across years of shared hardship and, eventually, shared healing. "Whatever title you choose," she said finally, "I only ask that it never separate me from these boys. Whatever I've become to this family, that matters more to me than any formal recognition ever could." "It never will," Corwin promised her, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice carried a weight that extended far beyond the simple words themselves. In the years that followed, Blackthorn Pack rebuilt itself into a kingdom stronger and more just than it had ever been, under the golden but ultimately fragile rule that had preceded Draven's betrayal. Cale grew into a young man who carried his father's strength alongside a wisdom born of hardship that few heirs to any throne ever truly possessed, understanding, in a way his father himself had only learned through loss, exactly how fragile power could be when it forgot the people it was meant to serve. Finn grew alongside him, warm and steady, the kind of presence that reminded the entire court, again and again, that even the darkest chapters of history could give way to genuine joy and healing, if only enough patience and love were given the chance to do their quiet, essential work. And Elira, the Omega maid who had once been overlooked entirely within the halls of a golden but ultimately hollow kingdom, remained at the center of the family she had saved, not through any accident of fate, but through her own unwavering choice, made in the terrible chaos of a single burning night, to protect what mattered most, whatever the cost. King Corwin Vale had once lost everything a man could lose: his throne, his mate, his freedom, and very nearly his sons as well. But in the quiet, unassuming courage of a single overlooked maid, he found something that no betrayal could ever again take from him: a family bound not by blood alone, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and a love that had proven, across 5 long and difficult years, far stronger than any crown.